Good evening, everybody. Tonight's talk is class politics dead? Now, the photo that you see here is from a 1966 satirical sketch on social class, which was in the Frost Report, which was a program, if you're too young to remember it, was on BBC. And in this sketch, John Cleese represents the upper class, Ronnie Barker represents the middle class, and Ronnie Corbett represents the working class. You can see this sketch on YouTube. This is, of course, a caricature of the class system. Now, when I did the presentation on the 1945 Labour election victory, I finished with the 1951 election when the Tories got a 17-seat majority. In the 1955 election, they increased their majority to 60 seats, and in the 1959 election, increased their majority further to 100 seats. So, what was going on? Now, some commentators at that time suggested that Labour was losing because class politics was dead. Now, to understand this, we first have to understand what is meant by class. And now, some of this presentation is based on an article that I had published in the April 2021 edition of Sociology Review, but certainly not all of it. If we're looking at what class is, the starting point for any systematic understanding or explanation of class is invariably the arguments of Karl Marx, not least because much of the debate since about class, since the 19th century, has been a response to his arguments, either an elaboration of his arguments, a revision of his analysis, or as a critique of his thesis on class. Now, Marx studied the whole history of humankind, and he concluded that the history of all societies to date has been the history of class struggles. Since the dawn of civilization, he argued there have been two major social classes, a ruling class and a subject class. And the power of the ruling class comes from its ownership and control of the means of production. By means of production, we mean things like land, capital, labour power, buildings, machinery, and so on. And the ruling class exploits and oppresses the subject class. Consequently, there's a basic conflict of interest between the two main classes. And class struggle throughout history has been the motor of change from one era to the next. It's these basic conflicts of interest that are the motor of change as all societies move through various stages of development, or epochs, as Marx calls them. So, for example, ancient civilizations like Egypt, Greece, and Rome were founded on the master-slave relationship. And whilst class antagonisms are always present, they sometimes break out into open revolt, which weakens the class system. Now, you're all familiar, no doubt, with the slave revolt in ancient Rome, led by Spartacus, which was made into, in my opinion, one of the greatest Hollywood films ever, starring Kirk Douglas. Now, though Spartacus's army of slaves was eventually defeated, This was one more nail in the coffin of the crumbling Roman Empire, the last of the great ancient slave societies. Notwithstanding the way that modern capitalist societies were built on the back of slavery, on the back of black slavery. Now, the Roman Empire finally collapsed in 476 AD after an interregnum of the Dark Ages. For the next 1,000 years, it was gradually replaced by the feudal system across Europe and beyond. In feudalism, the main antagonistic classes were the nobility and the peasantry. Peasants are not working class in the modern sense because they were tied to the land and had to pay tithes or taxes to the nobility for their use of the land. But like every other epoch, the contradictions were such that the feudal system was already crumbling by the 14th century. As a result, there were numerous peasant revolts. The most damaging one, of course, was the Peasants' Revolt in England. That is, was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But like all epochs, feudalism wasn't static. It was constantly changing to try to avoid disintegration. Then, of course, in England, there was the English Civil War, which threatened to end aristocratic rule. But these struggles weren't just going on in England, but they were also going on across the whole of Europe. In some countries, it was a more dramatic break with feudalism. In France, the revolutionary slogan was liberty, equality, fraternity, and the aristocracy were purged and a republic was established. It was a period of significant turmoil that transformed France's political landscape, ultimately abolishing the monarchy and the feudal system. And as in Britain and elsewhere, this was because feudalism had become a fetter or brake on the growth of two new social classes, the bourgeoisie or capitalist class and the proletariat or working class. Members of the working class own only their labour power, which they hire out to the bourgeoisie in return for labour. These two new social classes have gradually emerged over several centuries, but were now the prominent, though not exclusive, forces in capitalist societies. Now, class is very complex, but Marx argued that despite these complexities, the basic conflict between these two classes was the real motor of social change. In most societies, the break with the past was not quite so dramatic. Vestiges of the previous ruling class continue for some time, albeit that their power is reduced. So, for example, in Britain, we still have a monarchy, an aristocracy, a House of Lords, and so on, which are left over from the old feudal system. But most of the real power lies with the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. So for Marx, class is relational, and all history is the history of class struggle. Societies are driven by class antagonisms which create historic ruptures in the social formation and the development of new social relations. In capitalist societies like Britain, the class struggle has manifested itself in the struggle by workers to establish the right to be trade unionists, which grew during the 19th century, becoming more and more militant. Strikes, especially by unskilled workers in the 19th century, such as by the Tolpuddle Martyrs and the Bryant and May Match Girls, exposed the class nature of capitalist society and the basic antagonisms that existed between workers and the bourgeois class. I suppose the miners' strike of 1984-85 was probably the last great conflict between capital and labour. However, Marxists argue that conflict between the classes rarely manifests itself in such dramatic fashion. It's going on all the time in a much less organised and sometimes not very helpful way. From the guy who pours super glue into the clocking in clock because he resents having his every second recorded, to workers taking sickies as a form of protest. So, how does capitalism work? Capitalists own the means of production and use it to exploit the subordinate class who have only their labour power to sell. This gives one class economic power over the majority. And that economic power leads to huge inequalities in the distribution of wealth and income. At its core, the driving force behind social change is class conflict. Culture and class identities are a consequence of two things. Firstly, culture and class identities are a consequence of A, the ideological power of the capitalist class. So for Marx, class cultures and class identities are a consequence of the ideological power of the capitalist class. In other words, their capacity to have their ideas and their views as dominant in society. But also, secondly, culture and identities are a consequence of class opposition to capitalism, because class consciousness and opposition to capitalism will increase as the contradictions of capitalism become ever more evident to the working class. Now, whichever of those two things predominates in people's identities in capitalist societies is dependent on the degree of class consciousness. So, was or is Marx wrong? Well, first of all, some would argue that class consciousness has not developed as a part of people's social identities as predicted by Marx. In fact, what we have witnessed, argue some people, is the opposite. What we've witnessed is the atomization of the working class. Identities that are consistent with the interests of capital now seem to predominate rather than class identities. So, for example, people identify themselves by what they consume, which is obviously in the interests of capitalism. What we've also seen is that polarization of the classes into two giant opposing classes and dichotomization, a dichotomy between those two classes hasn't happened. You know, Marx argued that everyone will eventually be driven into one camp or the other, either identifying with the capitalist class or identifying with the working class. Indeed, what we have witnessed in the 20th century was an unprecedented growth in a new middle class. And by a new middle class, we mean a middle class of people like doctors, lawyers, university lecturers, architects, accountants, and so on. They've all expanded enormously during the 20th century. Um, However, capital still dominates and has now globalized. In fact, even more so as huge multinational companies with vast amounts of wealth now dominate the globe. That's something that Marx predicted. Many so called The other criticism of the criticism is that many so-called middle class occupations are really working class in Marx's sense of the term class. In other words, these are people who have only their labour power to sell. So whether you're doing a white collar job or a blue collar job is not the point. In fact, to some extent, there has been a proletarianisation of the middle class. Many middle class groups have less autonomy, mechanisation has diminished their power, and many of them are now trade unionists, especially in the public services. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that there are significant differences between highly skilled professionals and the type of workers who are unskilled, on the national minimum wage, and on 0 hours contracts. Not just in terms of income, but also in terms of power and influence, status, lifestyle, and culture. So, how do we explain these differences? This leads me on to the second theorist that I want to look at, Max Weber. Weber was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, and he elaborated on Marx's theory of class, but he was also critical of some of Marx's arguments. He argued that in modern capitalist societies, stratification systems are based on a mix of class, status, and party. So let's take each one in turn. Social class. He says, yes, classes can and are created by antagonistic economic relations. However, Weber argued that there are other antagonistic economic relations in capitalist societies, such as the relationships between borrowers and lenders, landlords and tenants, and so on. And also, financial capital has become increasingly important in late capitalist societies. Also, Weber argued that capitalism creates markets where supply and demand may in itself create classes. Those with the greatest skills are usually in great demand, but also in short supply. So they can demand higher salaries and better terms and conditions of employment. So class is therefore also caused, according to Weber, by different market situations that people find themselves in. A class can be a group whose members share a similar market situation by virtue of better or worse education or skills. So think about the difference between brain surgeons and road sweepers. Surely, argues Weberians, They're in different social classes. So that's class. Secondly, on status, status groups, Weber argued, are groups who have a sense of a common identity and purpose and share the same estimation of their worth. Those with high status enjoy privileges due to the prestige they command. Now, there are varying degrees of status throughout stratification systems. So, for example, why can I put my name to somebody else's passport application, as I did this morning actually, as a member of a profession and because I have a doctorate? Why can't it be a road sweeper or an office cleaner that does it? On average, they're probably no less honest than I am. But status is often due to distinctive habits, lifestyles, and restrictions on interaction with non members of the status group. So, for example, the upper class. So, for some in the upper class, for example, being rich is not enough. You know, lots of the old upper class view new money as vulgar. And anything, where anybody became rich or their family became rich in the last 200 years is sometimes by some of them considered to be new money. New money can never be upper class, and losing one's wealth doesn't necessarily diminish one's status and identity with the upper class. Now, having said all that, class and status are often linked. Economic privileges can sometimes be used to acquire status. So, market situation and status often go hand in hand, but not always. I mean, take the example of the vicar and the sex worker. Traditionally, the local vicar had high status in the community, but because of a decline in religious observance, their market situation is now not very good. The sex worker, on the other hand, has low status in the eyes of society, but can command high earnings because her skills are in great demand. She is in a good market situation. So I hope that illustrates it quite well. The third element that Weber argued creates stratification into classes is what he called party. This could be done, so party really is the mobilisation of a group to exclude others and to ensure higher rewards for the group. So this could be done by status groups or classes. Examples could include professions, particularly the qualifying associations like doctors and lawyers. They're the ones that set the exams, so they decide how many people to let enter the profession. You have to qualify to be part of the profession. Um, uh, Qualifying associations mean where the profession themselves have the legal status of deciding who practices and who doesn't. Now, with lawyers, it's the bar, and with doctors, it's the British Medical Association. Because of this, they have power to some extent to determine their own incomes, lifestyles, and so on, unlike the lower professions such as teaching and social work, where the state decides who can practice. The second sort of party are political parties who recruit leaders from a political elite. The Bullingdon Club, for example, is a private all-male club for Oxford University students. It's known for its wealthy members, grand banquets, boisterous rituals, and vandalism of restaurants and students' rooms. The club is known to select its members not only on the grounds of wealth and willingness to take part, but also by means of education. In other words, with undergraduates who were formerly pupils at various public schools, such as Eton, Harrow, Shrewsbury, Rugby, Westminster, Charterhouse, and Winchester. Some members of the Bullingdon Club have gone on to become leading figures within Britain's political establishment. These include the former Prime Ministers David Cameron and Boris Johnson, former Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne, and former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. And the third kind of party is the aristocracy that excludes outsiders by hereditary principles. You can only get in by inheriting a title. So these groups operate a form of social closure to outsiders, maintaining their privileged positions. So a Weberian approach to class status and party is especially helpful in explaining the new middle class, particularly the higher professions, and at the other end of the scale, the so-called underclass, those at the very bottom, who have got very little or no market power, status, or ability to mobilise social closure. I mean, sociologists use the term underclass. It's not a term that I like to use because I think it has all sorts of negative connotations for the worst off in our society. So, however, based on all of these ideas, this is how the class structure has typically been represented since the Second World War by sociologists. Now, whilst Labour was traditionally the mass party of the working class, it was argued that the growth of the middle class was gradually undermining their electoral base in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, there was a massive growth in white collar work, and that was accompanied by three general election defeats for Labour to the Tories in 1951, 1955, and 1959. So by the late 50s, it was being argued that Labour was still appealing to an electorate that no longer existed. The old heavy industries like coal mining, shipbuilding, steel production, based on close-knit traditional working class communities, were in terminal decline. And these communities of traditional proletarians, or trad proles as they became known in the trade, were the bedrock of Labour's support. But during the 50s, phrases such as class politics is dead and cloth cap politics is old hat were commonplace in both politics and the media. Not only were the middle class and the professions in particular growing, but also the old industries were being replaced with newer, lighter industries involved in the production of consumer goods. In 1962, in this book, Clark Kerr argued that the demands of modern technology and an advanced industrial economy required an increasingly highly educated, trained, and skilled workforce, which had led to higher pay and higher status occupations. So skilled technicians were rapidly replacing unskilled labour like miners and so on. And this had led to much greater affluence amongst the working class. Now, this book by Kerr was about the United States, but the same arguments were used in Britain. In this book in 1957, Jesse Bernard also argued that working class affluence was related to the needs of an industrial economy that was dependent on a mass market for consumer goods. New technology had led to increases in productivity, which had led to increases in wages, which in turn had created the ability of working class people to afford more consumer durables. Indeed, the 1950s saw a massive increase in working class people buying televisions, washing machines, fridges, and cars, going on foreign holidays, and with some even buying their own homes. By the end of the 1950s, the Tory Prime Minister Harold Macmillan declared this. So, social commentators were arguing that higher incomes had led to working class people adopting middle class lifestyles and aspirations that were inconsistent with socialist values. This is known as embourgeoisement, a process by which bourgeois aspirations and a bourgeois lifestyle were becoming institutionalized amongst the working class. The process, it was argued, was accelerated by the demands of modern industry for a more mobile labour force. This tended to break up traditional close-knit working class communities found in the older industrial areas. So the geographically mobile, affluent workers moved to newer suburban areas where they were largely indistinguishable from their middle class neighbours in terms of lifestyle and political views, or so it was argued. Despite the fact that class was as important as ever, the argument was that most affluent workers didn't see it that way, and that's why they were abandoning the Labour Party. The phenomenon is said to undermine working class consciousness, lead to class de-alignment, that's de-aligning themselves with particular political parties, and so frustrate the historical mission of the proletariat as an agency of revolutionary social change. Now, class de-alignment refers to the weakening of the historical link between social class and voting behaviour, where individuals no longer consistently voted for the party traditionally associated with their class. This shift led to a decline in class alignment, the long-standing pattern where the working class predominantly supported Labour and the middle and upper classes backed the Conservatives. The overall trend was that class was no longer a reliable predictor of voting behaviour. Now, whilst class remained a factor, voters were now more influenced by particular issues, by party image and personal values rather than by long-standing class loyalties. This reflected broader partisan alignment where voter attachment to major parties was declining, leading to higher levels of non-voting. So where we used to get and particularly still do, older people saying, I've voted Conservative all my life and I will continue to do so. Younger people are switching their votes or not voting at all. The key factors driving class de-alignment are the changing class structure, um, so the decline of heavy industry and manual work, with more people in service sector jobs, often in cleaner, smaller workplaces with weaker trade union traditions. Decline of working class communities, greater social and geographical mobility was leading to communities becoming more mixed. Embourgeoisement, as I've already said, growing affluence had led some working class voters to identify as middle class, reducing their loyalty to Labour. Also, cross class cleavages, so issues like immigration and public versus private sector employment were now cutting across class lines, influencing voters more than class identity. And also party policy shifts. Labour's move to the centre, for example, attracted more middle class voters. And it's argued that this class de-alignment has continued to this day. But this was nothing new. The concepts of embourgeoisement and class de-alignment actually have Marxist origins. So, for example, Frederick Engels attempted to explain the failure of the British working class to exploit the franchise in the 19th century that was extended to skilled workers in 1867 because of the workers, in his words, craving for respectability and enjoyment of a standard of living sufficient to encourage bourgeois values, lifestyles, and political ideals. Marxists since then have often deployed this argument as an explanation for working class acceptance of capitalism. This proposition only attained much greater credibility by non-Marxists like Clark Kerr after the Second World War. However, in the 1950s, the evidence on which the embourgeoisement thesis was based was largely impressionistic, speculative, and anecdotal. It needed to be tested with rigorous and systematic research. Now, one of the first empirically grounded studies of this supposed phenomenon was conducted by Zweig in the 1950s with interviews with workers in 5 British companies. But the most influential and important research was the affluent worker in the class structure studies by Goldthorpe, Lockwood and others at Oxford University in 1963 and 1964, which was much more rigorous in testing the hypothesis of embourgeoisement and to some extent greatly undermined the credibility of the argument. Now, what they did in this study was they tried to find the most favourable setting for a confirmation of the hypothesis of embourgeoisement and argued that if it wasn't happening there, then it was unlikely to be happening elsewhere. And they chose Luton, at the time a prosperous area with expanding industries producing consumer goods. The sample was 229 manual workers and a comparative group of 54 white-collar workers of various grades. Nearly half of the workers had come from outside the southeast in search of stable, well-paid jobs. All of them were married men, and 57% of them were either buying or owned their own homes. They were all highly paid compared to other manual workers in the rest of the country. So they tested the embourgeoisement thesis in four main areas. First of all, in their attitudes to work, they found that the workers had an instrumental orientation to work. In other words, work was just a means to an end. Now, like trad proles or traditional proletarians, they saw improvements in their lives coming through collective bargaining rather than career progression. But it was instrumental collectivism rather than solidaristic collectivism. In other words, collectivism was just a means to an end. So slightly different. They looked at their interaction in the community. They found that they were not adopting middle class lifestyles. Like traditional proletarians, their friends were predominantly working class kin and neighbours. However, they did tend to lead a more privatised, home centred existence that involved things like watching television, gardening, do it yourself, and socialising with the immediate nuclear family. In terms of aspirations and social perspectives, unlike the middle class, who had a prestige image of society, they had a pecuniary image of society. In other words, the workers saw society purely in economic terms. They saw society as consisting of one large central social class that contained most manual and non-manual workers and their families. And workers contrasted this central mass with one or more small social classes with vastly superior spending power, and that they variously called millionaires, high society, and well to do. Some of the workers recognised a small, impoverished class at the bottom that they referred to simply as the poor. Now, most importantly for this presentation on whether or not class was dead in terms of politics, they found no lack of support for the Labour Party. In fact, at the 1959 general election, 80% of the workers that they interviewed had voted Labour, much higher than for the working class as a whole. However, support for Labour was again instrumental rather than an act of solidarity. In other words, it was conditional on Labour delivering real economic benefits for them. Indeed, after 13 years of Tory rule, the 1964 general election saw the return of a Labour government under Harold Wilson, and Labour were in government for 11 of the next 15 years. One of the problems was that there was a tendency in many of the studies, such as the Goldthorpe et al. Study of Luton workers, to assume that workers hold a clear, consistent, and coherent image of society, and a tendency to mould their data into neat, tidy categories. But nearly all studies have produced inconsistent results. So, for example, the Luton workers were said by Goldthorpe et al. To possess a pecuniary or money model of society. When you look at the figures, only 54% thought like that. What about the other 46%? What did they think? Indeed, this reader, edited by Martin Bulmer, has a chapter in it on research done by Robin Blackburn and Michael Mann. In 1970 to 71, they studied the ideology of 951 unskilled manual workers in Peterborough. They found that both right wing and left wing views coexisted in workers' ideology. They concluded that the workers didn't possess a consistent image of society. And this wasn't surprising, they argued. On the one hand, workers had experienced subordination and exploitation in the workplace, which would make them more left wing, but they were also exposed to the ideology of the dominant class, which was broadcast by the mass media, the education system, and other establishment institutions that support existing social arrangements. As a result, they argued, workers remain confused by the clash between conservatism and proletarianism, but touched by both. Then along came Thatcherism. One of the main aims of Thatcherism was to try to change the aspirations and perspectives of the working class from a sense of collectivism to one of individualism through what was described as a property owning democracy. She enabled working class people to buy their council houses, insisting that local authorities did not use the money to build more council houses. She privatised state-owned industries and encouraged working class people to buy shares in the newly privatised industries, or actually gave them the workers' shares when they were privatised, so they would have a stake in this so-called property owning democracy. In reality, it wasn't a democracy at all. Many of the council houses eventually ended up in the hands of private landlords, and shares were sold off to big business for a small profit, concentrating wealth in fewer hands than ever before. It's also obviously not a democracy if it depends on a person's ability to pay. Nevertheless, the individualism and self-interest that these policies encouraged, it was argued, was responsible for a greater degree of embourgeoisement amongst the working class and subsequently 11 years of Tory rule. But again, the evidence was all anecdotal and speculative. Actually, I said 11 years of Tory rule. It was more than that. It was 11 years of Thatcherism, or of Thatcher. But as again, I say the evidence was all anecdotal and speculative. After the dismal Labour performance at the 1983 general election, on the basis of his studies of British voting patterns, the academic Ivor Crewe argued in a Guardian article entitled "The Disturbing Truth Behind Labour's Rout" that there was a new working class which would explain the failure of the Labour Party to retain working class loyalty. Crewe believed that there was a new working class that possessed one or more of these characteristics. They live in the South. They are not union members. They can be distinguished. Sorry, they work in private. That should be a not in there. They are not union members. They work in private industry. They own their own homes, and they can be distinguished from the diminishing number of the old working class who live in the north, belong to unions, work directly or indirectly for the government, for example, in coal mines or in the steel industry and so on, and live in council houses. Crewe believed that this new working class were deserting the Labour Party in large numbers and abandoning the traditional proletarian socialist collectivism. He accepted that traditional proletarian collectivist views continued to exist, but he argued that they were being held by an ever decreasing segment of the population. However, in a study conducted in 1998 by Gordon Marshall et al., they refuted the idea that there was a new working class. I was actually at Gordon Marshall's lecture when he delivered his findings. Um, Based on a national sample of 1,770 adults, Marshall et al. Argued that the sectionalism, instrumentalism, and privatism amongst the British working class that they found was nothing new. Echoing Engels, they argued that in the 19th century there were artisans and the so-called labour aristocracy that I talked about in an earlier presentation. Those 19th century workers were highly sectionalist, conservative with a small c and with a large c, belonged to exclusive skilled new unions, and they put an emphasis on their home life as well as having an instrumental attitude to work. Also, Marshall et al.'s data suggested that contemporary workers did not follow completely privatised lifestyles and that class was still the most important variable in voting patterns. They came to similar conclusions to Blackburn and Mann that workers didn't have a coherent view of the world and often gave inconsistent answers. Also, in this study, published in 1992, Fiona Devine analyses the social and political perspectives of the British working class at Luton during the decade of Thatcherism. So what she did was she re-evaluated the findings of the 1960s study of Luton workers that was conducted by Goldthorpe and others from some 30 years earlier. And she interviewed 30 male manual workers and their wives. She concluded that rather than holding beliefs about politics and society based on the individual, as the earlier study suggested, the 1980s working class shared both a communal identity and a dissatisfaction with the unfair distribution of monetary rewards in Britain. She examined the motivations, processes, and consequences of geographical mobility amongst manual workers and explored working class lifestyles and the extent to which they may be described as privatised or communal. She also discussed different aspects of people's daily lives, sociability with relatives and friends, conjugal roles, leisure, material aspirations, and crucially, politics. Like the earlier study, she found high levels of geographical mobility. However, most people had not moved to Luton for higher living standards, but for greater job security. And for those who had moved from London, they'd moved for more affordable housing, either to rent or buy. On their orientations to work, overall Devine followed Goldthorpe et al. In describing the workers' orientation to work as instrumental collectivism. But she did find more evidence of collectivist attitudes than had appeared to be present in the earlier study. Now, whilst critical of some of the tactics of unions, workers still saw them as a collective means of securing working class interests. The concern with money and living standards didn't prevent them from feeling a sense of solidarity with their fellow workers. In terms of friendship, lifestyle, and norms, in short, she found that lifestyles were neither as communal as that as trade poles, nor as home-centred and privatised as was suggested by the earlier study. This was because in the intervening years they had been followed by kin and friends to Luton who also sought jobs and better housing. Networks of kinship and friendship had been rebuilt in Luton. People were less isolated than they had been in the 1950s and 60s, and they were less likely to be so dependent on the nuclear family. So there was actually a decline in privatism. On images of society like Goldthorpe et al.'s subjects, they had a pecuniary model of society, seeing themselves belonging to a mass in between the very rich and the very poor. They didn't perceive a split between the working class and the middle class. They felt a resentment to those who had inherited money and a sense of injustice at the existence of extreme class inequalities, even though they mostly didn't realise how extreme these differences were. They wanted redistribution of wealth and the creation of a somewhat more egalitarian society. On political attitudes, she did find evidence of a declining support for the Labour Party. However, she didn't find that this disillusioned Labour Party supporters had abandoned their belief in the values traditionally associated with voting Labour. They had aspirations as consumers, and their living standards had risen, but they still wanted to see a more egalitarian society. Their withdrawal of allegiance was temporary because of the Labour Party's political failings. Even the small number who said that they would be switching their allegiance to the Tory party in the next election, it was hardly with wholehearted enthusiasm. For them, the only positive attraction of voting Tory was their policy of selling council houses, which was seen as giving people the chance to better themselves. Overall, Devine argued that the seeds of class consciousness remained within the working class. The workers she studied wanted to improve their living standards and those of their families, but that didn't prevent them from perceiving society as unjust or from desiring change. So, if Devine thought that the workers she studied contained the seeds of class consciousness, what is class consciousness? A class consciousness is a full awareness of the reality of exploitation, a recognition of common interests, identification of an opposing group with whom their interests are in conflict, and a recognition that only by collective class action can that opponent be overthrown. So, when practical steps are taken in pursuit of this last goal, the working class becomes not just a class in itself, but also a class for itself. So it's often argued that proletarian traditionalists contain certain elements of class consciousness. The emphasis on us and them implies some recognition of common class interests, an indication of class solidarity, and at least a vague awareness of an opponent with whom workers are in conflict. However, As indicated earlier, it was argued that workers in the newer industries for consumer goods showed little of this solidaristic collectivism that might indicate the development of class consciousness. Also, as Major replaced Thatcher, he declared the oft-repeated myth that Britain was becoming a meritocracy. Now, this ridiculous idea that a meritocracy is possible was satirized many years earlier in 1958 by Michael Young in this fictional account of a society in 2034 when all privilege had been abolished. The plot describes a dystopian society in Britain in which intelligence and merit have become the central bases of reward, replacing previous divisions of social class and creating a society stratified between a merited power-holding elite and a disenfranchised underclass of the less merited. For this kind of society, Young coined the term meritocracy to describe and ridicule such a society. People are defined by their achievements rather than by the families they are born into. And social inequality can therefore be justified. However, a meritocratic education system and society creates new issues. The rich and powerful are encouraged by the general culture and become arrogant that their rewards are even more justifiable than under the previous society based on privilege. The poor are demoralized and have internalized the idea that their lower status is due to their own inadequacies. In a meritocracy, salaries are justified. The upper classes earn big salaries, the lower classes earn much smaller ones. The populists say that it is unfair and claim for more social justice. At the end of the book, a revolution is coming. Do read the book. It is so relevant in demolishing the arguments of the so-called social democrats in the Labour Party. Nevertheless, 1997 saw the election of Labour under Tony Blair spouting the same nonsense about a meritocracy as he set about transforming the party into New Labour. It was argued that Blair's success was because Labour had abandoned the idea of class war, because that once again was supposed to be an orientation held by a diminishing section of the population, and that consequently Labour could not get elected by appealing to these traditional arguments. With his message of Cool Britannia, it was argued that this was in keeping with the aspirations of a new working class who didn't see society in class terms. The argument rested on the view that class consciousness was a thing of the past. The evidence suggested otherwise. The word meritocracy was frequently used by Blair and his government and was adopted into the English language with none of the negative connotations that Michael Young had intended it to have. Young expressed his disappointment in the embrace of the word meritocracy and its philosophy by the Labour Party under Blair in a Guardian article in 2001, where he stated this. This is because once people have advantages, they are keen to have those advantages passed on to their children and have the means to be able to do so. It isn't and shouldn't be about equality of opportunity, but it should be about equality of outcome. This is where the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu comes in. In a whole series of books, he examines how social class is reproduced from one generation to the next under capitalism. So, first, you need to understand some concepts that Bourdieu uses. The first is the concept of habitus. This is an individual's disposition to the social world, a kind of personal culture, a stock of knowledges, histories, and experiences that we acquire over the years and carry with us that makes us who we are. Our habitus influences how we see the social world, our preferences, and our tastes. As we go through life, we acquire new habitus, but we never lose any of it. The second concept is the concept of field, as elaborated in this book and other works. By field, Bourdieu is referring to those settings that are external to the individual, a bit like the term structure. Fields can be quite general, like the economic, cultural, or political fields, or they can be more specific, like the university setting or your workplace. Fields are regulated by specific norms, rules, expectations, and behaviour. To be accepted in a field, you have to learn these rules. But of course, they differ between fields. The rules of behaviour in the field of Westminster politics, for example, are quite different from those on the football terrace. Success in any field is defined by how much of the appropriate capital that you possess. And he's not talking just about or even mainly about financial capital. Now, we're all familiar with economic capital. Your success in the economic field depends on and is measured by how much money you start with and have. But Bourdieu also talks about social capital, symbolic capital, and cultural capital. Clearly, economic capital is important in terms of the fields you find yourself in from the time you are born. But the importance of social capital cannot be underestimated. This refers to your social connections and valued social relations, who you know, who you associate with, and who you use in order to achieve given ends. Symbolic capital refers to honour, prestige, and reputation, what Weber referred to as status. And finally, there is cultural capital. Cultural capital is about your tastes and how these can be mobilised to succeed in life. Your success in university, for example, is measured by your ability to know things, not how much money you have. Cultural capital also refers to manners, taste, language, understanding of what's important in life, and so on. Our cultural capital, what we know and like, is intrinsically linked to our habitus. Different types of cultural capital are related to different social classes. So, by the new millennium, Roberts was arguing in this 2001 book that most manual workers still saw themselves as working class. But beyond this, there was little evidence of class consciousness. According to Roberts, the working class had become disorganised and consequently lacking in class consciousness. He argued that the working class had lost not only its capacity to act collectively, but even to develop a shared knowledge of its interests and common aspirations. Roberts believed that the working class had become disempowered by losing control over its key organisations, in particular the Labour Party, and through a reduction in the influence of working class movements. Now, Roberts gives a number of examples of this disorganisation and disempowerment. Trade union membership had declined. It had fallen from a high of 13 million in the 1970s to barely 6 million today. And many of these were in higher middle class professional occupations rather than in the working class. The Labour Party was no longer the party of the working class. New Labour had tried to dissociate itself from being a party representing working class interests. It weakened its links with the trade unions and tried to build closer links with employers. This process has accelerated under Starmer. The working class had consequently distanced themselves from trade unions and the Labour Party. Roberts argued that compared to the 1960s, fewer manual workers today are even instrumentally attached to trade unions and the Labour Party. The co-op, he says, used to be an organisation dedicated to serving the interests of working class consumers. Now, in the words and in Roberts' words, it has become just another retailer. And I can identify with that because my mum used to organise bazaars and jumble sales to raise money for the co-op in the 1950s. And working class youth people used to be involved in elections of co-op managers and so on. No longer is that the case. Also, Roberts argues close-knit working class communities had been broken up, and these were communities where solidarity had developed. The breakup caused by geographical mobility, the decline of heavy industry and urban redevelopment I've already talked about. So the working class had also become disorganised in its leisure patterns. Roberts argued that working men's clubs and other community free time organisations had been largely replaced by television and commercial leisure. As well as becoming disempowered and disorganised, the working class had also become devalued. They find it increasingly difficult to take pride in being working class. Roberts claimed that identifying with the working class is no longer associating oneself with a powerful group or a way of life with features that others should envy. To back up his claim, Roberts quotes from Beverly Skegg's research into a group of working class women in the northwest of England. Skeggs found that these women believed that it was stigmatizing to be working class and aspired to be respectable. Roberts admitted that men may feel differently to women about being working class, but nevertheless claimed that those who remain working class nowadays are likely to feel that they are being left behind. When he became Prime Minister, old Etonian millionaire David Cameron spouted the same old nonsense about a meritocracy. It suits their narrative to pretend that their position has nothing to do with their background. However, it just isn't true. In 2011, the coalition government published its strategy for social mobility entitled Opening Doors, Breaking Barriers. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, the policy document reasserted the political belief in the principle of meritocracy. And there's just one simple observation I would make about this. If the school you went to doesn't matter, why do these people still send their own kids to Eton, Harrow, Rugby, and so on? All the nonsense about a meritocracy is pure drivel. Meanwhile, the Labour Party, traditionally the party of the working class, was still dominated by Blairites, so there was little chance of changing this. Blairites kept pointing to the fact that Labour had won 3 general elections in a row under Blair. What they failed to mention was that each of these elections, Labour got a smaller and smaller number of votes. They were hemorrhaging their traditional working class base. Indeed, during Blair's leadership, Labour lost 5 million votes. As Marshall noted in their 1988 study for workers to develop a class consciousness rather than simply class awareness, requires that they be given explanation and direction. That is, they require organising. So, despite the potential for class consciousness, the British population had not been mobilised to support a programme that would tackle the source of their sense of injustice. In this respect, Marshall pointed their fingers at the Labour Party as having failed to tap the reservoir of potential support for class struggle and real social change. Then along came Corbyn, and really, you know the rest of what happened with the Corbyn project. And the way that Keir Starmer keeps banging on about his working class roots and keep telling everyone his dad was a toolmaker. And he's done more damage than anyone to working class interests. And he had the considerable help of the Labour Party General Secretary, David Evans. So I want to finish on the election of Hannah Spencer in the Gorton and Denton by-election. It demonstrated that the public are thoroughly sick of Westminster being dominated by a small, interconnected group of individuals from privileged backgrounds who went to public schools and went through the Oxbridge gravy train, far exceeding their representation in the general public, who act like, in Marx's words, the executive committee for managing the affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So they elected a working class woman, a plumber with socialist values, and her social class was a big factor in her success. Now, whether you think that the Green Party is a socialist party or not, the point I'm trying to make is that class does still matter in politics. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed this talk.